College football fans and media types like myself trying to determine if the Pac-12 can possibly strike a deal that comes anywhere close or possibly surpasses what the Big 12 was able to negotiate at $31.7 million per team per season. Welcome to the Voice of College Football. We break down the game we all love each and every day with you. Best discussion, debate, and analysis. Why? Because of your participation. Please subscribe to the channel and, of course, like the video. All right. We broke down the Pac-12 TV ratings for 2022 and, of course, took into consideration the impact of USC and UCLA leaving the conference. Check out the video. We've left it in the comment section below, where we also, of course, want to hear from you. Now let's get to the Big 12, because there is a obvious comparison right there, because the Pac-12 school is trying to determine how much money are we going to make and how was the Big 12 able to negotiate the contract that it did. Let's compare the TV ratings between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 before we move on. And then, of course, the two big brands, Oklahoma and Texas, leaving the Big 12. How will that impact TV ratings? Significantly, of course. Let's look at the Big 12 in 2022. So in weeks 0 and 1, we see 4 Big 12 games that showed up in the national ratings in the top 30, 3 in the top 15. And then we go to week 2. We've got the number 1 game in the nation. That was Alabama-Texas. So, of course, the Texas brand leaving the Big 12, and they were playing Bama. We've also got another top 10 game there, followed by 3 others that ranked in the top 20, a significant increase over the Pac-12. Check out that video. In week 3, we've got more non-conference games in the Big 12, and we've got a big one there with Oklahoma taking on Nebraska. Other than that, 3 fairly rated games right there at numbers 15, 23, and 24. Then we get to week 4, and we've got both non-conference games and conference games. So the two biggest games in the conference involve Texas and Oklahoma, 2 of the top 8 rated games for the week of week 4, and another top 15 game, and then the other non-conference games not as significant right there. In week 5, you've got, again, Oklahoma and Texas figuring in prominently with the 7th and 15th highest rated games of the week in college football, 2 of the top 3 in the Big 12. The Big 12 accounted for 4 conference games that were in the top 20 in terms of TV ratings. In week 6, another big matchup, of course, at number 5, even though Oklahoma was down last season, Texas to a certain extent, but they've been down for almost 15 years, a number 5 game in the national ratings and a very strong week 6. And then we've got 2 other games in the top 15, 4 total in the top 25. Week 7, we've got 4 games from the Big 12 in the top 12 in the nation, 2 coming, of course, from Texas and Oklahoma, as is customary. Consider that TCU's run made it a much bigger ratings factor this particular season than it normally is. When we go to week 8, we see the number 2 game in all of college football came from the Big 12, and 2 of the top 10, 4 in the top 15. We had 4 additional games in the top 15 in college football in week 9, including 1 in the top 5, 2 in the top 10, only 1 involving Oklahoma or Texas. Moving on to week 10, another decent week for the Big 12. And at this point in the season, you got to figure you've got 10 teams in the Big 12 in 2022, so you got 5 conference games, and they're typically ranking 3 to 4 of those games at least in the top 20 or 25 in the nation. There you see week 10 with 2 in the top 11, 3 in the top 20 in college football. Week 11 in college football, Texas and Oklahoma showing up once. There was the 3rd ranked game, and this is tough to do because the Big Ten and the SEC dominate the rankings, and you will see how the Big Ten and the SEC dominate as we march through all the conferences. But we've got 2 from the Big 12 in the top 15, and then numbers 21 and 27. Week 12 of college football, the penultimate week of college football, 2 in the top 7 there, and then 4 in the top 19. Then finally, rivalry weekend. It's tough to get TV ratings right there against the likes of Ohio State, Michigan, and other huge games across the nation. Well, the Big 12 did have a top 5 game, 2 in the top 11, and then you see Oklahoma and Texas with 2 of their games in the top 22, and by that time, Oklahoma certainly out of any kind of championship aspirations, so they were not ranking as well as they typically would. Now let's pull this all together to look at the very best TV ratings for the Big 12 in 2022 versus the nation. Texas TCU on ABC. There you see Texas TCU, the only game over 5 million viewers in the Big 12. It was the 22nd most highly viewed game in college football in 2022. So obviously 21 other games across the other 4 conferences ranked ahead of Texas and TCU. And then the other games, a number there at over 4 million per game, with Texas figuring in prominently at number 2, Texas, Oklahoma State. Then you see the TCU impact of them making a run to the college football playoff, taking on Baylor and even Iowa State and TCU. You wouldn't think that that game would factor in heavily, but it did last season because it was late in the season, and TCU, of course, playing for a playoff spot. As we go down through the rankings, it's obvious to see the impact of Oklahoma and Texas, as the Big 12 had 8 total games over 3 million viewers, and there you see Baylor and Texas late in the season, and also Texas Tech and TCU, a pivotal game for TCU as they came back in the fourth quarter at 2.5 million viewers. And then you see the big impact of Fox viewership, although the top 2 games in the conference last season aired on ABC. Now we're going to look at how many games cleared the 1 million mark, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in the Big 12. We're not going to compare it against the other conferences right now. Too much information. We're going to pull it all together at the end of the series, but we're going conference by conference. Check out the Pac-12 video. We're going to hit on the ACC, the Big 10, and the SEC as well. That one Texas TCU game hit the 5 million mark. That's it for the Big 12. In the regular season, conference games only. 4 over 4 million, 8 over 3 million, and then you see on down the line. Keep in mind, there were 45 conference games in the Big 12. 39 were rated. That's a high number because the Big 12 does not have a conference channel like the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 10, and the Pac-12, the other 4. So all their games, Fox, FS1, ABC, ESPN, ESPN2, a few made it to like ESPNU and so forth, and those were the games that were not rated at the time. And then they had a few games here and there that were only on digital. So 39 of 45 on major networks is really good for the Big 12. And there you see it right there with 24 clearing the million mark out of 45. The Big 12 championship game, well, Kansas State and TCU had a lot to play for, of course. And this was a fine ranking for the Big 12 at number 3 out of the conferences, of course, behind the SEC and the Big 10 at 9.4 million, but so far ahead of the ACC and the Pac-12, despite the Pac-12 playing by itself on Friday night and with USC gunning for a college football playoff appearance. Now we've got another factor to look at when we look at the Big 12, unlike the other 4 conferences. Of course, they've got 4 new members. What will their impact be? Well, we'll look at the 22 numbers. They're going to tell us something, but not everything, of course. Keep in mind that these schools should gain better viewership against better opponents in the Big 12 and more popular opponents, of course, in the Big 12, minus Oklahoma and Texas. Let's look at it. Cincinnati, Central Florida, Houston, and BYU. How did they do? Well, the most popular game in college football involving those 4 in 2022 also involved the SEC. That's got to be taken into consideration. 2.9 million people watched Cincinnati, Arkansas. We had BYU against Oregon at 2.58 million on Fox. Then other top 5 games included BYU and Notre Dame. We know what the draw is there at 2.5 million, although BYU games do fairly well. They had a Utah State game that was at 1.26 million. That seems pretty high and pretty strong for them. It was on ESPN. Those games draw well when it's on the main ESPN channel, the main Fox channel. You see others there in the top 10, and these are all, again, involving the 4 new schools coming to the Big 12. Now, keep in mind that I looked at 29 games that were ranked nationally in TV ratings involving those 4 teams. So 29, and there were 10 that cleared the 1 million mark. The rest of them, oh man, you got some really bad TV results like Cincinnati against Miami of Ohio on ESPNU, 185,000 people watching that game, 107,000 watched UCF and Georgia Tech on EU, and so forth. But again, those are also tied to the network. ESPNU games are typically in the 100 to maybe 400,000 to 500,000 range tops. So those are the ones that were most affected. I think there's one other factor to consider here. Even when you're looking at non-Texas and Oklahoma games, those are being bolstered in 2022 and before, of course, by Texas and Oklahoma fans watching a lot of Oklahoma State football, TCU, Baylor, Texas Tech. Our Houston fans, they'll probably be the most engaged initially in the conference because of obvious ties to those schools. However, Are UCF, Cincinnati, and BYU fans going to be watching Oklahoma State and Kansas State play? Probably not as much as Texas and Oklahoma fans that have had a long history and investment in the conference. So Cincinnati, UCF, Houston, BYU, will they have an impact? Well, it's going to be positive and negative. They should get better TV ratings than they did last season and previous seasons because they're going to have better opponents. However, they're not going to be watching, their fan bases will not be watching the Big 12 other games as much as the two teams leaving. I think that's pretty obvious. It's intriguing to look at the TV ratings and then try to put it into context in terms of how it projects forward. Your thoughts down below in the comment section. Of course, check out the Pac-12 video because that sets it all up in regards to this is where the Pac-12 stands. Now let's compare it to the Big 12. We're going to move on through the ACC, the Big 10, and the SEC as well to see how TV ratings show the popularity of college football games across the nation and how the networks themselves affect the ratings and the viewership. Right here at the Voice of College Football. Please subscribe.